and sit down at the table with love.
Today I'm excited to walk you through the pattern of the spring feast and show you how 3,500 years ago Moses took the people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt and brought them to a mountain. And this whole process actually was the beginning of the Leviticus 23 spring feast pattern. Now, of course, they didn't know they were walking through a pattern. They were just slaves excited to get out of bondage to a cruel taskmaster, and they had no idea where God was taking them. Their whole story, starting in Exodus 12, when God came down and began delivering them out of Egypt, was actually the first time this pattern was walked through. Moses walked them through it perfectly. And then we see in Deuteronomy 18:18 says that in the future a prophet like Moses would come and walk through it perfectly as well. So today I'm going to show you the parallel of what happened in Egypt as they walked this out, and then compare it to 1,500 years later when Jesus came down and walked through this exact same pattern of redemption. I think it'll blow you away. It did me when I first saw it, how perfect it is, how planned it is, how he waited for the perfect time in history to come down. His timing is really important, and sometimes it's easy to think that he's taking his time, or I'm sure the Jewish people thought he would never come, but then he breaks in sometimes just at the darkest hour and comes down and does amazing things. So once you see how he perfectly fulfilled this pattern, I'm hoping you'll be 100% convinced that he'll do the same thing at his second coming and fulfill this pattern perfectly. So it's fun to look at. So let's start with Exodus 12, because that's where the story starts. That's where his courtship with Israel begins. Exodus 12 is where his love story finally gets to be walked out. God's waited for this moment. He's going to take a bride who's in bondage and slaves in Egypt, and he's going to take this bride out. It's why the Jewish people to this day will read the Song of Solomon at Passover, because it's their love story. They're his bride, and their courtship, they believe their courtship with their bridegroom, God, began in Exodus 12. So this is where the story begins, and it's where our story begins too. So starting in Exodus 12, also we'll put some things up on the screen, but you've also got a chart of how he fulfilled the feasts in your study guide for today. And it's also found on page 258 and 259 in my book, Finding the Afikoman. So you should be able to, there's another chart that we're going to go through that you'll have today too. So hopefully that'll help. So let's begin where this pattern begins and go to Exodus 12:1. Actually, Exodus 12:1 is where he changed the calendar that we talked about before, because now his love story was going to unfold. He wants it separate from the world's story. This is his story. But let's start in Exodus 12:3, because it says in Exodus 12:3, the first thing they were to do, it says to Moses, "Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month." Now remember, if you go back to your calendar, we'll include a calendar in your study guide, but if you go back to the calendar, the new first month that used to be the 7th month is Aviv, also known as Nisan, and you'll see it there. So on this day, Aviv 10, on the 10th of this month of Aviv, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for his household. So the first thing they were to do is every household had to go and select a young lamb without spot or blemish, and they were to tie it to a little stake right next to the threshold of their front door, of their dwelling. This little lamb would be examined for 4 days to make sure it was perfect and the perfect sacrifice. So now let's fast forward. You can see on the chart 1,500 years later, we see that on the 10th of Aviv, Jesus, on this chart, we'll see in a minute that the Passover, when the Passover lamb was killed, remember, they take the lamb on the 10th, tie it to the door, to the post next to the door, and examine it for 4 days. So then on the 14th, we'll see in a minute, at 3 in the afternoon, I'll explain that too, the lamb was to be killed. Okay, it says, so if you look at the 14th on this chart, and Jesus' day in the first century, the 14th was on a Thursday, and at 3 p.m. So it says in John 12, 1 and 2, it says 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus was, who had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. There he had a supper, and Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table. So we see that 6 days before Passover on the 14th, we know where Jesus was. He was at Mary, Martha, and Lazarus' house. And so let's count back on that chart. We see the 14th there, where Passover at 3 p.m., where the Passover lamb dies. Let's count back 6 days, and it'll take you to Saturday evening on the 9th. We'll learn later when we talk about the Sabbath. This is really important, even the timing of the days of the week when Jesus fulfilled this. But the Sabbath would have started at sundown Friday night on the 8th of Aviv. So this is the eve of the 9th at around sundown. And at sundown on the 9th, when Jesus was having dinner with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, it was known as a Havdalah service. A Havdalah service in Judaism is at the end of the Sabbath. The Sabbath would be ending at sundown on the 9th, on that Saturday evening. As the sun went down, they had to say goodbye to the Sabbath. The Sabbath was such a special time. It was such they were stepping into a day in the future when all things, when Tikkun Olam would be fully realized, when the world was perfect. So they rehearse the Sabbath and proclaim it as that day when all will be perfect again. God will have his bride and the earth will be perfect. So they rehearse that day for 24 hours and step into the perfection of that day and rest, because it is eternal rest once this world is restored. Rest from all the evil anyway. So that's the picture, is they're saying goodbye to the Sabbath. And because the Sabbath is a delight, it's the day that all the other days of the week serve the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is such a special day that between God and Israel, that as the sun goes down at the end of the Sabbath, in this case it would have been the 9th when Jesus was there for dinner, they would have had a Havdalah service. And at a Havdalah service, I brought one here to show you. It's my mother-in-law, Omi's set. They would take they'd fill a cup like this, fully to the brim with wine. They would have a spice box. And if you opened it up, it would have all these, like cinnamon and just really strong spices, a little spice box like this. And so the cup is filled fully with wine. There's a little spice box here that they pass around and smell. And there's a candle that it's braided. It's 4 strands that are braided. And the Havdalah candle is lit. And you're supposed to be able to see, as you hold it up to the flame, you can see it through your fingers. And this is passed around in front of everybody. And also the spice box, the strong spices, to remember the delight of the Sabbath. They're going to have to leave the Sabbath, what's coming in the future. They're going to have to leave that day and go back into the work week. And so they want to say goodbye. It's likened to, it's like God's saying, I don't want the Sabbath to be over, so let's linger a little bit longer with each other and make it special. I don't want to say goodbye. And so there's kind of a mourning, but also just a savoring of the Sabbath before they have to say goodbye. So as the flame of the Holy Spirit is passed around, and the spices are passed around for them to smell, so they'll remember throughout the week the sweetness of this day. And then at the end, the wine, which represents the joy of the Holy Spirit, it's spilling over the cup. When they put the candle in and the flame goes out into the wine, it's extinguished in the wine and the wine spills out. It's to symbolize, let the joy of the Lord, let the joy of the Sabbath spill out for the whole week. So it's this really beautiful ceremony. And the reason I'm telling it to you now is because When you read this portion of Scripture, when Jesus was there having dinner with Mary and Lazarus and Martha, this is where Mary washes Jesus' feet with her, anoints him with his costly perfume, takes her hair and rubs the oil all over his feet, and the oil is dripping down his head, onto his beard, on his body. This costly perfume that would have been her whole inheritance, her whole future security. She anointed him literally for burial. Of course, the other disciples didn't understand, and she was rebuked for it, wasting such costly perfume that could have fed the poor. But Jesus knew what she was doing, and he commended her for it. What's interesting about this is it was a Havdalah dinner. They would have passed around the spices. But Mary did more than just a spice box. She knew what was about to happen, and she anointed Jesus with this costly perfume. And all the way to the cross, 6 days later, that perfume, that smell was so strong. Those oils are so strong. If you've ever dropped any kind of scented oils, are very strong, and the oil is hard to get out of clothing. It's certainly hard to get out of your hair. And the beautiful picture in this is that all the way to the cross, that Havdalah evening, when Mary anointed him with those, precious oils, even hanging on the cross, he could smell the aroma of her love and be reminded of the joy set before him. This bride, Mary, who sat at his feet and loved him, and a whole bride of people that would come into the kingdom before his return and be in a wedding chuppah with him someday. So going to the cross, paying a bride price, paying that price for his bride. It was the joy set before him, the aroma of those oils to remind him. I don't know, it's just so beautiful. So I just love that even the days of the week that Jesus would be having dinner on a Saturday evening as the Sabbath was saying, they were saying goodbye to the Sabbath, that even that was the time when Mary anointed his feet and anointed his hair and anointed his body to remind him of her love as he paid the ultimate price, bride price for her. I don't know, just amazing. So it was this day, the 9th, and remember, a Hebrew day at sundown turns to this day at sundown then would turn to the 10th. It's sundown to sundown is one day. So the next morning, on the 10th, it says that Jesus went in to Jerusalem. So it was on this day when Jesus went into Jerusalem after his dinner with Mary and Martha on that morning of the 10th. It would have been a Sunday morning. He rode in to Jerusalem on that donkey to fulfill Zechariah 9:9, that he was lowly riding on a donkey. On this day, what was going on in Israel was they were getting ready for the Passover, and they would be carrying the lambs from the fields outside of Jerusalem. A lot of them were bred in Bethlehem and all over the hillsides outside of Jerusalem. They would have gone out to get the Passover lambs, and the high priest would bring the Passover lamb carried in his arms, representing the nation of Israel. He would be carrying this Passover lamb into the streets of Jerusalem, and the people would put palm branches on his pathway as he carried the lamb in. As the priests carried the lamb in, they would be saying, Hosanna, Hosanna, God save us, God save us. 118, the Hallel, which is the songs of praise. So during this processional, the people on the sidelines would say, Save now, I pray, O Lord. I pray, send now prosperity. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We have blessed you from the house of the Lord. God is the Lord, and he has given us light. Bind the sacrifice with cords to the horns of the altar. You are my God, and I will praise you. You are my God, I will exalt you. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his mercy endures forever. That's from Psalm 118, 25 through 29. And so the palm branches, the rejoicing that the Lamb was coming in this processional, it was on the 10th of Aviv that they would bring the Passover lamb into Jerusalem, and they would tie him. There was different courts in the temple. They would put him in the court where, not where the sacrifice was done, in the holy place, but in the common court. They would tie this lamb to an altar to be examined by the priests and the Sadducees and Pharisees for 4 days. This little Passover lamb would be tied there and to be examined. And so we see it was the same day that Jesus, on the 10th of Aviv, when the Passover lambs came in, Jesus, who was the Passover lamb, came into Jerusalem following this processional and walked through on this donkey to the cheers of the people, the palm branches being waved, and who were saying, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Now, his disciples and his believers might have gotten the picture and known what he was about to do. I don't think so, but some of them might have. But it was so profound that he was walking in this processional as the suffering servant Messiah, ready to become the Passover lamb. And so it was on the 10th, and then for 4 days, just like the little Passover lamb that was tied to this altar being examined in the temple court, Jesus was in the temple court and in Jerusalem these 4 days, and it's where they were asking him his hardest questions. He was examined by the Pharisees. Whose figure is on this coin? They showed him a coin. Do you give to God or do you give to Caesar? And Jesus answered brilliantly, this question. And it said for 4 days they asked him his hardest questions, and he answered them all, and to the point where they just walked away shaking their head because they couldn't find anything wrong with them. And that was the declaration. We can't find any fault with them. And even when he went before Pontius Pilate, he said, I find nothing wrong with this man. So just like the little lamb had to be examined, Jesus was examined those 4 days before his death, and it said they could find nothing. He was perfect. So anyway, that's the 10th of Aviv that he perfectly fulfilled. He came into Jerusalem as the Passover lamb, was examined, and was found perfect. So now let's go to the next day in Exodus 12:6. If you go back to Exodus, let's read the next step that God instructed the nation of Israel to do. It said, "Your lamb shall be without a blemish. A male of the first year, you shall take it from the sheep or the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day." We just talked about that, of the same month. "Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight." So after examining their little lamb outside their dwellings in Egypt, they were instructed to kill it at twilight. Twilight, the word there in Hebrew is Bain Arbaim, which means between the evenings. What that actually means, between the evenings, is really there's four major prayer times in Judaism in the temple, even in ancient Israel, and it was all according to the sun and the moon and the sunsets, and they would look to the time of the day. And the first one was a morning oblation, it was called the minor morning oblation, from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. was a prayer time. And then from 9 a.m. to noon was called the major morning oblation. Then from noon until 3 p.m. was the minor evening oblation. From 3 to 6 was the major evening oblation. So these were just the set prayer times. Between the evenings was 3 p.m. because the minor evening and the major evening. And so 3 p.m. was right between those two evening prayer times. So twilight, to Jewish understanding, is between the evenings at 3 in the afternoon. We're also told in Exodus that Exodus 12:8 and 9 that the lamb was to be roasted before sundown. According to the Talmud, it says that the lamb was roasted upright on a pomegranate stick. The lamb was to be gutted, and its intestines were to be removed and put over its head. And the lamb is referred to as a crowned sacrifice. That is amazing if you think about Jesus being the crowned sacrifice, being roasted, or not roasted, but on a pomegranate stick on a cross with its arms out. Amazing picture of the future death of Jesus. Okay, so now let's fast forward 1,500 years to the time of Jesus. The little lamb and the Passover lamb that would have been in the temple court to be examined for 4 days, at 9 in the morning was moved up to the altar. There was 6 steps leading up to the altar, and he would be up at the altar where he would later be killed. But he was moved there at 9 in the morning to be killed at 3 in the afternoon. Okay, we know that Jesus, at 9 a.m., at the 3rd hour of the day, according to the custom, the lamb was put up at the altar at 9 a.m., and killed at 3 p.m. And it says now at the 3rd hour they crucified him. So at 9 a.m., the third hour of the day, from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., that would make 3 hours. The third hour of the day, it says that Jesus was crucified, Mark 15:25. So at the same time the lamb was moved to the altar, Jesus was put on the cross and crucified. And for those 6 hours, that said there was darkness over the whole earth. Then it says at the ninth hour, which would have been 3 p.m., the high priest, between the evenings, between the two prayer oblations, the minor and the major evening oblation at 3 p.m., the high priest would slit the lamb's throat and let the blood drain out, and he would declare that it is finished. It would be said this term, it is finished, would be said at the end of the daily sacrifices and of the peace offering as well during different festival offerings. So we see that exactly at 3 p.m., the same time that this lamb was being killed in the temple, at the very same moment, it says in John 19:30, when Jesus received the wine, the sour wine, he said, "It is finished," the same thing they declared in the temple, and bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. So as the Passover lamb, Jesus perfectly fulfilled Exodus 12:6, and he became all the offerings mentioned in Leviticus 1-7, doing away with them forever. So yes, he was the Passover peace offering, but we'll see later when we get into the fall feast teachings in another class that he was all the offerings, once for all, Hebrews says. Okay, so that was the 14th. Let's go to the 15th, because we see now that Jesus perfectly fulfilled Leviticus 23:5, becoming the perfect Passover lamb according to the instructions given in Exodus 12. It was perfect to the day, to the hour, to the timing, everything going on in the temple. So the 15th of Aviv, let's go to, we know that from Leviticus 23:5-8, that on the 14th day of the month at twilight is the Lord's Passover, and on the 15th day of the same month is a feast of unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, but you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord for 7 days. The 7-day week shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary week on it. Okay, so I want to go back to something, because you've got to see again on this chart that I was showing you the days of how on the 10th he was at Mary and Martha's for a Havdalah, and then it says 6 days before the Passover. Well, I want to draw your attention to something that is important to see also of how he fulfilled not just the perfect pattern of the Passover lamb, but I want to show you that now when we come to as we walk through this chart, I just want you to see the timing of this. So if you count we know that Jesus, the night before he died at Passover on the 14th at 3 p.m., becoming the perfect Passover lamb. We know on the 13th at sundown, that day, Jesus said to his disciples, "Go and prepare a Passover for me," which they did. And this Passover took place in the upper room. It would have happened at sundown. The meal would have happened at sundown. It would have been when it turned to the 14th at sundown is when they had this meal. It was known as the Day of Preparation. When the Passover meal is traditionally eaten, would have been on the 14th after the lamb was killed and then roasted, and they would have their meal before, at sundown. Instead, Jesus had his Passover meal with his disciples on the Day of Preparation. It would have been on that Wednesday at sundown they had this Passover meal. And that's important, and I'll show you why in a minute when we count these days and you see the pattern perfectly fulfilled. So on the 15th, so on the 14th at 3 p.m. he was killed. It was still the 14th. But in 3 hours, around 6 p.m., whenever the sun went down, let's just say 6 p.m., it's not exact, the Pharisees said we have to get him down before the Sabbath. Now, the 15th, it says what we just read in Leviticus 23:5-8, that it's a Sabbath, it's a day, it's a holy convocation. It's known as a high Sabbath. There's a few of these in the feast cycles. They aren't the weekly Sabbath, called a Shabbaton. It's just means a high Sabbath. So this is what the Pharisees were referring to. Even though it was a Thursday night, not the traditional Friday Sabbath, but it was the Sabbath of unleavened bread, when they would eat this Passover meal together. And so it was a holy convocation. It was a rehearsal, and it was a day of rest where no work could be done on it. So it's a high Sabbath, a Shabbaton. Jesus had to get off the cross. They had to take him off the cross before sundown when they ate their Passover meals that night. That makes sense because it says that Jesus was to be in the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And I always wondered if he died on the weekly Sabbath, which would have been, sundown on Friday night, the 15th, then that means he would have only been in the grave for 2 nights and 2.5 days. And the numbers never made sense to me. And if you see that it was the high Sabbath of unleavened bread on Thursday, the 14th, then he would have been in the grave. That it accounts for the 3 days, or 3 nights and 3 days that he was in the grave. That raising from the dead on the morning of the 3rd day. It just fulfills the timing of the days perfectly. So that convinced me. Once I found that, I thought, oh, that explains it. We just didn't have that Sky King decoder ring that John talks about. We didn't have the pattern, the Jewish code to make this make sense. So not that celebrating Good Friday isn't, I know it's traditional, but I don't believe that Jesus died on Good Friday. We know that on the 15th he was taken off the cross before sundown, and it said that in Exodus they were to take this lamb, roast it, eat it, and then they were going to, that night, the lamb was killed at 3 in the afternoon in Egypt, and then they roasted it, prepared their unleavened bread quickly. It didn't have time to rise. God said, put your sandals on your feet and get ready to go and eat this meal and put the blood on your doorposts. And we know that at sometime at midnight around midnight is when they left Egypt. They left their dwellings. As all of Egypt, there was a cry in Egypt at midnight heard, of mourning, for all the Egyptian firstborn sons were dead. And it was during this time at midnight that the children of Israel, after eating this meal with the Lord, being spared by the blood on the doorposts, left Egypt, started their journey towards the Red Sea. And they traveled all night. It turned to sundown on the 15th. They traveled, and the first day on their way out, they got Joseph's bones. And it says that as they traveled in the dark, and then it says they camped, they got Joseph's bones. Exodus 13:19 says, and Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had placed the children of Israel under solemn oath, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you. Joseph's bones were a prophecy to them that they would be leaving. And so they were obedient, and the first thing they did was they went to Joseph's grave and got his bones. Okay, so fast forward 1,500 years, and we see that it turned the 15th at sundown, after 3 hours after Jesus died. They got his body off of the cross, and they took him to a grave of a man named Joseph. I think that's amazing. They went to the children of Israel in Exodus. The first place they went was to Joseph's tomb and got his bones, and Jesus was placed in a tomb of this wealthy man, Joseph of Arimathea, offered up his grave. So this is so perfect. It's amazing. He was put on before sundown. He was taken down and put in the grave, fulfilling unleavened bread, the festival of unleavened bread. When he went in the grave, just like the children of Israel. If we read in Exodus 12:4, we see that they were told not to break any of the bones of the Passover lamb. They were not to be broken. And it says in John 19:31 through 37, I won't read the whole thing, but it said that when the two thieves on each side of Jesus, when he was on the cross, it says the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who were crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And so it was fulfilled that not one of his bones shall be broken, just like the Passover lamb in Egypt. Jesus' bones were not broken. Forgot to tell you that. His body was wrapped in linen, and it says in Mark 15:46, and they took him off the cross, put him in Joseph's tomb, and rolled the stone against the grave. So the children of Israel stopped to get Joseph's bones in Exodus 13:19. It says that the next place they go, they stop overnight, and then the next day they arrive at the Red Sea. So let's go now to Aviv 17. the day it would be, if you look on that same chart, he's in the grave, he's in Joseph's tomb, and we know that he was raised from the dead on Sunday morning, the 17th. So if you count, there's 3 days and 3 nights, and in the morning of the 17th is when Jesus was raised from the dead. But it's also the day, if you follow along in the book of Exodus, Moses only let them go for a 3-day journey. God does everything legally. After the 3-day journey, Moses and the children of Israel are pursued by Pharaoh at the Red Sea. They couldn't, this is where they needed the miracle. All the chariots of the Egyptian army were, coming against them, and it was the 16th of Aviv when they got to the Red Sea, and they were right at sundown of the 16th, becoming the 17th, is when Moses cried out, and God said, "Stand still and see the salvation of God." And the children of Israel, we see, passed through the Red Sea that whole night of the 17th of Aviv. And still in the morning of the 17th, they were raised on the other side, on dry ground, resurrected from that water, and could look back and see Pharaoh and all his army drowned in that sea after they pursued them. They were legally set free from Pharaoh's possession. On this same day, we see Jesus raised from the dead, and it was the day of the next spring feast. We saw how he went in the grave at the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And now on the 17th, it says that to count in Leviticus 23, it says to count 23, 10, and 11, the next spring feast, the first fruits of the barley harvest. It says, when you come into the land, reap the harvest, I want you to take a barley sheaf and wave it before the Lord. The high priest shall wave it. The priest shall wave it, and it says, and to wave it the day after the Sabbath after Passover. So this can sound confusing, but it's really not. After the weekly Sabbath, so take the week of Passover, whatever day of the week Passover falls on, the day after the weekly Sabbath, and that week of Passover would be when you count the first fruits of the barley harvest. You're going to see on modern Jewish calendars today that they always count the first fruits of the barley harvest the day after Passover. As if this isn't all sometimes confusing enough, they have to add things like this. But I'm just going to clear it up for you right now. In the time of Jesus, the Pharisees said that it's the day after the Sabbath of unleavened bread that you're to count. The Sadducees said, no, this is not the high Sabbath of unleavened bread, right after the Passover lamb dies. This is the weekly Sabbath. So if that's the case, the day after the weekly Sabbath will always be on a Sunday. It never got resolved. A lot of the Israel calendars today, the Jewish calendars today will mark it like the Pharisees said, the day after Passover. But I really believe that the Sadducees were right about this one, that it was to count after the weekly Sabbath, the first Sunday, the first day of the week of Passover would be the first fruits of the barley harvest. So I believe that the first fruits of the barley harvest is always on the Sunday following Passover, the Passover week. They're still split on this. Some of them say one, some of them say the other, but the reason I'm so convinced is because this was the pattern in Exodus. This was the pattern that Jesus followed at the first century. So I'm going with what he walked out, because he died on the 14th of Aviv, that Thursday, at 3 p.m. The first fruits of the barley harvest is 3 days later, and he was in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights. And I believe that on the 17th of Aviv, on that first day of the week, Sunday, is the first fruits of the barley harvest, when the children of Israel were resurrected out of the grave of the Red Sea to dry land, and it's the exact same day Jesus was resurrected out of the grave, met Mary in the garden where he was near his tomb to greet her on that resurrection day, on the 17th of Aviv, the first fruits of the barley harvest that he was fulfilling. Now what's interesting about that day is in the temple what was going on at 9 a.m. at the major morning oblation. The high priest would take a sheaf of barley cut from the fields, because it was the first fruits of the barley harvest. He would take that sheaf of barley, climb those 6 steps to the altar, and wave that barley sheaf before the Father. As he ascended those steps to the altar for his offering to be received, he would say, "Don't touch me, I have not yet risen." In other words, I have not gone up and waved before this sheaf before the Father. So he was to remain pure until that offering was made to the Father. And now that explains. When I read that, I thought, that so explains. It always bothered me when Mary, who Jesus loved, and she loved him so much, and how excited she must have been to be the first one to see him after his resurrection. And I believe he intentionally waited to encourage her and to see her before he ascended. But when he said to her, she wanted to hug him, I'm sure, and I'm sure he wanted to return that affection, but he said to her, "Don't touch me, I'm not yet risen." And I thought, what does that mean? Why would he say that to her? It sounded so harsh, and it never made sense until I realized that he was the high priest, and he was fulfilling these holy feast days. He was becoming the first fruit of the barley harvest offering before the Lord, and he hadn't ascended to heaven to be waved as that offering yet. He just, I believe, wanted to see Mary before he did it. But it makes sense that she couldn't touch him. He had to remain holy and pure, ascending up to heaven, waving himself before the Father on that day. But then he came down and had a meal with them and the disciples. So he appeared to them then for 40 days, very intimately, involved and present with them. That just helped me explain why he said that to Mary. So that's the third spring feast, the first fruits of the barley harvest that Jesus perfectly fulfilled. And then we see that the next spring feast, Shavuot, it says that they're to count. There's something called the Omer count. And from the first fruits of the barley harvest, they start this Omer count of 49 days, 7 times 7. So every day they'd say day one of the counting they'd take a measure of barley and pour it into a bowl, or I don't know what they counted it in, but they take a measure of barley each day and say day one of the counting of the Omer. And this was a really actually tender, intimate time, because there was an expectation. In the book of Exodus, the children of Israel, once they crossed the Red Sea, God was taking them on, it's 7 times 7, it says in Leviticus 23, that counts 7 weeks from the barley harvest. So they include the day of the barley harvest. So it's the day of the barley harvest plus 7 times 7. So that makes 49 is 7 times 7 plus 1, 50. So from the first fruits of the barley harvest, count those 50 days, and God was taking them somewhere. And we know that he took them on a journey. He took them to a journey to Mount Sinai, where he was going to do a marriage ceremony. We'll see that later when we talk about Shavuot. But it was a journey, and during that 40 days, he was very present with them. He was taking care of them. He was a husband to them. He was intimate. He was giving them manna. He was giving them water from a rock. He was protecting them from their enemies. He was their heat and a fire by night and a cloud by day. He was shading them from the heat of the day. He was very present all the way to that mountain. And we know that in Exodus 19 is where he met them on that mountain. And that's the last spring feast of Shavuot on the next month, called Sivan 6. So during this time after Jesus ascended and he had a meal with them, during that, he was with them 40 days, 40 of the 50 days. And he still had that last spring feast to fulfill of Shavuot. And he was with them, present with them. He was cooking them meals on the beach. It doesn't record all that they did that 40 days. It only says that the books, that there would be so many books written about it that we couldn't contain them. There was so many things that happened, and I would have loved to have seen what happened in those days. Another interesting thing, and I forgot to say this, about the first fruits of the barley harvest, when he was raised, it was more than just him. There was a whole sheaf. There was a first fruits offering of other people that came out of their graves that day that were seen walking around Jerusalem. That is such a strange story to me. I can't even imagine what that looked like, but it was more than just him. He brought others with him as that wave offering, that resurrection day. So it was the first fruits of the barley harvest. I have a lot of questions to ask the Lord about that and who those people were and what happened to them after, if they ascended back up with him. I don't know, but they were resurrected with him, and that's a phenomenal thing. And it says that we're also first fruits, that we'll be raised too. So anyway, these 40 days, he was present with them, and we see on Sivan 6, the last spring feast, the former rain feast, we see that God meets his people on a mountain and enters into a marriage covenant, which I'll go into why I see it that way and why I believe that. So we see that on that day, Jesus ascends after the 40th day. Then there's 10 days, and he says, meet me and don't tarry. Be in Jerusalem. I want to meet with you one more time. He tells them to go wait for him, that he's going to do something more, and he wants to fulfill. He tells his disciples to wait, and he's going to fulfill one more feast. And we'll go into that a lot more when I talk about the 4 cups of redemption. But basically what he did was on Shavuot, or what we know as Pentecost, there was a whole bridal contract that was happening in that upper room, that last Passover, and then 50 days later, he gave them the gift of the Holy Spirit. He gave a gift to his bride. So he perfectly fulfilled the last spring feast by showing up in power as he did in Exodus 19 for the children of Israel. So it's an incredible pattern, and it's a bridal pattern, and it's just amazing to the day, to the hour. There's so many details that I've only seen a few, but the ones I've seen totally convinced me that if Jesus perfectly fulfilled the spring feast, the former rain, became the suffering servant, Messiah ben Joseph, walking into Jerusalem, coming on a donkey, fulfilling all these scriptures, I just know, don't you just know it, just deep in your heart and your spirit, that he's going to perfectly fulfill the pattern of the fall feast when he comes the second time as conquering king? I just love that he left clues behind. Now we can look at the spring feast pattern and look back, and it's always 20/20 vision as you look back, but I think he left enough clues for the fall feast that there's some things that we can kind of piece together, scriptures that line up, and scriptures that he's going to fulfill, and so many things in the ceremonies, just like the spring feast ceremonies, that make sense. And it's a really, really amazing pattern. The pattern of Leviticus 23 is just amazing to me. It's our story, and it's the beginning of our story. So in the next sessions, I can't wait to share with you the 4 cups of redemption of Passover and how it follows the pattern of all of these spring feasts. I'll show you the bridal story that I've found that really will thrill your heart. So look at this pattern again, go over it again, and if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them when we have a live Q&A, but look at it and tell God what a genius. I looked at this, it's so brilliant, and it's amazing that in time, he could wait 1,500 years, line up the days, line up the dates, line up even the fact that he had to wait until a conqueror like Rome came, because the other people that conquered Jerusalem, conquered Israel, would destroy their worship, would put up their gods in their temple. But the Romans believed that if they conquered a place, that the God in that place gave them favor. So they allowed the worship of that God to go on instead of destroying it. And so it even had to be the Romans that he had to come in the time of the Romans, who would still allow their religion, their Jewish religion, and their temple to remain. So it's also perfect. Anyway, bless you.